Hello and greetings from New York. And I should start by saying that I'm really sad I can't be with you today in person. That's partly because as a financial journalist, I'm fascinated by the themes you've been discussing, but also because before I became a journalist, I trained as a cultural anthropologist. And with that perspective, I'm always fascinated by the gigantic tribal rituals which are investment banking conferences. In many ways, these conferences, rituals, play the same function for modern financial world and society as gigantic tribal wedding rituals in a place like the Hindu Kush. You use these rituals to pull together a scattered tribe, to reaffirm social ties and networks, to also express and reaffirm a shared worldview and a creation mythology. Now, in many ways, that is very benign and positive. I'm sure what you've been doing in the last couple of days is talking about ways to manage risk better, to swap tips about financial innovations and trends, and in general, to make finance better for yourselves and the world at large. Hooray! But any such gigantic ritualistic tribal ceremony can also run the risk of creating a sense of tribalism, groupthink, blinkered vision, tunnel vision. I say that because back in 2005, I went to one such conference down in the south of France, talking about credit derivatives, and was so struck by the contradictions in the creation mythology and the sense of groupthink and tribal tunnel vision that it caused me to go away and write a series of pieces warning about dangers brewing in finance and the risks of the system, which of course subsequently turned out to be depressingly correct. Now, I dare say that you all feel today that you've learnt from that terrible 2008 financial crisis, that you're never going to go down that path again, that you know about the need for risk management and not succumbing to blinkered tunnel vision, etc., etc. I'm sure it's true. Hooray. But the reality is that the 2008 financial crisis isn't the only time when essentially tunnel vision and a failure to think about the wider context of finance and the implications of finance have caused problems. In many occasions, financiers have become trapped in their sort of ivory towers, disconnected from the real world, and have ended up doing things which kind of made sense at the time when you looked at it purely in terms of blinkered, narrow vision, but subsequently looked absolutely crazy when you looked at it with the benefit of hindsight, or, if you like, common sense. The wider common view, the wider view you get when you bust out of your narrow tribalism and groupthink. You've seen that, say, with the way that economists have used financial models in the past and economic models. I mean, just think about it. Until very recently, most economic models did not pay much attention to, say, climate change risks. Most of them didn't really look at issues like political populism, geopolitical threats, medical risks. Most balance sheets treated those kind of issues at best as simply a footnote to the corporate accounts. There was a sense in which the models, the balance sheets, and the big data sets we were using were all useful within their own specific prescribed field, but actually they ignored the wider context. And although that may not matter if the context is not changing, today, of course, we live in a world when the context is in tremendous flux and where geopolitical risks, medical risks, social and political risks, and of course climate change risks are becoming increasingly important. But they're also the kind of risks that most of the tribe of bankers who tend to go to investment banking conferences have not been trained to look at or to consider. Now, the good news is that things like the rise of the environmental, social and governance movement shows that some of this mentality is changing. There's lots of ways to make sense of ESG or to frame it. It's often presented as basically a series of risk metrics, box-ticking exercises, or corporate governance measures that are quite formulaic, that make many corporate boards and chief investment officers pretty frustrated, and which inevitably have many, many flaws. And we at the Financial Times have written recently about some of the challenges in ESG and some of the contradictions in the metrics and some of the charges around greenwashing, woke washing, reputation washing, call it what you would like. But the reality is that if you strip aside the details of ESG, if you look at the wood, not the trees, what's really going on here is an attempt to change how business and finance looks at the world. To get out of that narrow tunnel vision, basically just looking at economic models as rigidly defined, looking at balance sheets as essentially bounded entities, looking at narrowly defined big data sets, getting out of that tunnel vision and embracing lateral vision, trying to look at the context of economic models, of financial activities, of businesses, trying to look at the wider implications of what financiers and bankers are doing, trying to look at the consequences of, if you like, everyday markets and financial flows. It's about lateral vision, not tunnel vision. It's about something that I've called anthrovision, because as I say, I'm trained as an anthropologist. I wrote a book last year trying to explain what this means in terms of applying these perspectives to the financial markets. I called it anthrovision because in many ways anthropologists are trained to look at the world holistically, to look at context, to essentially look at the world using the same lens of ESG and see how all the different bits join up. So the good news, as I say, is that that wider lateral vision is increasingly creeping into how financiers do their business. And that's challenging some of the groupthink, it's challenging some of the tribalism, it's challenging some of the narrowness of perspective that have created so many problems in finance in the past. The bad news, of course, is that humans are humans. We're all prone to groupthink and tunnel vision and tribalism, journalists included. Let me stress that again, journalists included. We all have our creation mythologies, which are riddled with contradictions, because we all like to tell ourselves convenient, if not lies and half lies about what we're doing, which rarely match reality. That's essentially what anthropologists do in terms of looking at the difference between what we tell ourselves we're doing and what we're actually doing. That's the bad news. But as you leave the conference, I'd like you to give you two thoughts to take away. The first is that even if you think that ESG is just about box ticking, even if you hate the idea, even if you can see all the flaws in its underlying concepts, do not lose sight of the fact that what ESG and sustainability is about is fundamentally a shift in perspective from tunnel vision, just looking at economic models and corporate balance sheets, to lateral vision, trying to see the world in a joined up way. We need that now more than ever, given the extraordinary long list of uncertainties which are flying around the world, be that medical risk, climate change risk, geopolitical risk. I could go on and on. Or to use another metaphor that I employ in my book, Anthrovision, if you go through life today just relying on economic models, financial algorithms, narrow corporate balance sheets to try and navigate the future, you're like somebody walking through a wood with a compass. Your compass may be brilliant. You don't want to throw it away. It's useful. And that applies to economic models. But if you just look down at the dial all the time and never raise your eyes, you will walk into a tree. That's the danger of having tunnel vision, not lateral vision. And the second thought I want to leave you with is that, as I said at the beginning, investment banking conferences are wonderfully fascinating, gigantic, ritualistic affairs. They're a chance for the tribe to come together, to reaffirm their identity, reaffirm their knowledge base, and hopefully become a bit wiser about the future. But every time you have tribalism, you have the danger of groupthink and tunnel vision. And the only way to counter that is to think about the context and also to think about what the tribe is not talking about. To study what anthropologists call the social silences, the parts of our world that we take for granted, that seem boring and dull and obvious and just don't worth any merit or discussion, and which often journalists ignore completely. Back in 2005, the financial industry was swathed in social silences, like the fact that the people who were creating subprime mortgage CDOs didn't actually see how the end users were actually using them in ways that were quite different from what the financial models had implied. Today, there are probably all other types of social silences out there that you're barely even aware of. So, a week from now, ask yourself, what did we talk about at this conference? But what did we not talk about too? Think about social silences. Think like an anthropologist, even if you are a financier, because I like to think at the end of the day that can make us all a bit wiser. Thank you.